A chance encounter. Officer Jacob Foster adjusted his sunglasses, scanning the peaceful suburban streets from his patrol car. It was a quiet afternoon in Meadowville, where manicured lawns and white picket fences painted an image of calm. After over 2 decades on the force, Jacob was familiar with the routine of the town, the typical ebb and flow of daily life, and prided himself on knowing the ins and outs of his patrol routes. In his mind, Meadowville wasn't just a town, it was a legacy. His father had served as an officer here, and Jacob had spent his career upholding his father's values. He believed in keeping the peace, sometimes through tough measures, but that was how law and order held their ground. Or so he thought. Community outreach programs and talks of empathy seemed like fluff to Jacob, who trusted in his gut instincts and a stern approach. To him, Meadowville didn't need softness, it needed strength. Today, a call had come through about an incident at the local high-end shopping district. Bella's Boutique, a luxury store in town, had reported suspicious activity. Jacob's pulse quickened. Real action was rare in Meadowville, and he welcomed any chance to remind the community that he was there to protect them. Parking his patrol car outside Lux Scoocher, a designer boutique popular among the town's wealthier residents, he walked through the glass doors. The scent of expensive perfumes hit him, and as he scanned the room, he caught sight of a woman near the back of the store. She was black, tall and graceful, her movements deliberate as she examined an array of silk scarves on a display rack. She wore red jeans and a matching blazer, stylish, but in Jacob's eyes, unusual for the typical Lux Scoocher shopper. A sense of unease prickled the back of his neck. She was alone and appeared absorbed in browsing, but something about her seemed off to Jacob. He watched as she ran her fingers over the fabrics, carefully picking up items to inspect them before setting them back down. To any other observer, she was just shopping. But to Jacob, she looked out of place, almost as if she were casing the store. Taking a deep breath, Jacob approached her with a no-nonsense look. The woman noticed him when he was only a few steps away, her expression a blend of curiosity and caution. "Ma'am, may I ask what you're doing here?" Jacob's tone was more accusatory than curious. The woman looked surprised but maintained her composure. "I'm just shopping, officer. Is there a problem?" Jacob crossed his arms. "Shopping? Ha! Funny. I've been watching you, and it looks more like loitering to me. Haven't seen you purchase anything." The woman's brows furrowed. "Do I need to make a purchase immediately to be allowed to browse, officer?" Jacob's gaze narrowed. Her calm confidence grated on him, challenging his authority. "Let's see some ID," he demanded, adding, "It's standard procedure when we suspect suspicious activity." The woman sighed, reaching into her purse. "My name is Kendra Taylor, officer," she said, handing over her ID with steady hands. Her voice was even, but her eyes held a flicker of irritation. As Jacob looked at her ID, he caught the faint whispers and curious glances of other shoppers who had noticed the confrontation. But Jacob's mind was already made up. "I think you should leave," he said coldly, handing back her ID with a flick of his wrist. "I don't need trouble here, and you clearly aren't buying anything." Kendra's eyes filled with a mixture of shock and sadness, her composure faltering momentarily. She inhaled deeply, holding herself steady. "Officer," she began, her voice tinged with frustration, "I don't understand this treatment. I haven't done anything wrong." Jacob waved her off dismissively. "Like I said, I don't need a reason to ask you to leave. This is about keeping the store safe." His words hung heavy in the air, a final command, leaving no room for her to argue. With a slight shake of her head, Kent returned and headed for the door, her steps deliberate, her head held high. Jacob watched her leave, a self-satisfied smirk spreading across his face. He was certain he'd just prevented some crime in the making. As far as he was concerned, he had kept the store safe, doing what any good officer would do. But as the glass door swung shut behind Kendra, a small woman with graying hair hurried over to Jacob, her expression anxious. "Officer, you've made a mistake," she said in a hushed voice, her eyes darting nervously toward the door. "That woman you just asked to leave. She's one of our best customers." Jacob's confidence faltered for a second, but he shrugged it off. "Ma'am, I was just doing my job. I saw suspicious behavior, and I acted on it." The boutique manager shook her head, looking upset. "Her name is Kendra Taylor. She and her husband are well respected in this community." She paused, swallowing, as if bracing herself for her next words. "Her husband, Officer Foster, is Captain Marcus Taylor, your commanding officer." The name hit Jacob like a punch to the gut. Captain Marcus Taylor, the man he respected, the man who had mentored him, the man who was strict yet fair, was her husband. Doubt started to seep in, but Jacob quickly dismissed it, clinging to the belief that he had done his job correctly. With a forced nod, he brushed off the boutique manager's words and strode back to his patrol car. Yet, a gnawing unease accompanied him as he slid into the driver's seat. Could he really have been mistaken? For now, Jacob chose to ignore that whisper of doubt, driving off with the hollow satisfaction of a job done. Though maybe, just maybe, not well done. Consequences unfold. The precinct bustled with the usual rhythm as Officer Jacob Foster stepped inside, adjusting his belt and nodding to a few colleagues. He moved toward his desk, still replaying the afternoon at Lux Couture in his mind, almost savoring the confrontation. He'd kept the store safe, and he was confident in that, despite the boutique manager's protests about Kendra Taylor's standing in the community. But as the familiar scent of burnt coffee filled his nose, his satisfaction waned. Just then, a firm voice echoed from behind him. "Officer Foster, my office." Now, Jacob turned, his stomach sinking as he recognized the voice. Captain Marcus Taylor stood in the hallway, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Jacob's chest tightened. It was unusual for the captain to call officers into his office unless it was serious. Following Captain Taylor, Jacob entered the office, feeling a faint prickling of unease. Captain Taylor gestured for him to take a seat, and Jacob obliged, his gaze nervously flicking to the framed family photo on the captain's desk. Kendra's smile beamed up at him, her arms around two laughing children. A lump formed in Jacob's throat as he made the connection. This was the woman he'd just humiliated at Lux Couture. "Let's get right to it, Foster," Captain Taylor began, his voice calm yet intense. "I received a call from my wife today, Kendra. She was humiliated and accused of theft in a store she frequents. The officer involved was you." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Jacob's face flushed as he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Sir, I was just doing my job. I thought something seemed off." Captain Taylor's expression hardened. "So you assumed my wife, one of the most respected women in this community, was up to no good because she seemed off." Jacob felt his throat tighten, but he didn't back down. "With all due respect, Captain, I had my reasons. She wasn't buying anything, and her behavior appeared suspicious. My instinct told me to intervene." Taylor sighed, a deep, tired sound. "Instincts, Foster, aren't always what they seem, especially when tainted by bias. Have you considered that perhaps your assumptions were colored by something you hadn't consciously realized?" Jacob's jaw clenched, and he struggled to maintain his composure. "Sir, I don't believe I did anything wrong. I'm here to uphold the law, and I did what I thought was right." Captain Taylor's eyes bore into him, a mix of disappointment and frustration etched on his face. "Foster, let me ask you this. If you'd seen anyone else, a white woman, perhaps, dressed similarly, would you have reacted the same way?" Jacob hesitated, then looked away. The answer lingered between them, unspoken but clear. "Foster, this isn't just about today," Taylor continued. "This is about the pattern I've noticed in you. I see the way you interact with certain people in this community. Your father was my mentor, and he believed in fairness, in upholding justice without bias. I expect the same from you." Taylor's tone softened, but his words held a sharp edge. I'm not firing you, Foster, but I am putting you on probation for a month. You'll be under review, and if I see any more incidents like this, I won't hesitate to take further action." Jacob felt his chest tighten. Probation. In his 20 years of service, he'd never been reprimanded, let alone put on probation. "Captain, please. I can." Taylor raised a hand, silencing him. "You'll also be participating in community outreach with my wife, effective immediately. You'll attend her meetings, observe, and listen to people you might never take the time to understand. You'll learn, Officer Foster, or you'll face the consequences." Stunned and humiliated, Jacob rose from his seat. "Yes, sir," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dismissed," Captain Taylor said, his gaze lingering on Jacob as he left. Outside, Jacob's emotions simmered beneath the surface, a mixture of anger, confusion, and shame twisting in his gut. How dare Captain Taylor, no, how dare Kendra, question his actions, his integrity? They hadn't seen the things he'd seen, hadn't dealt with what he had. And now he was on probation, his spotless record marred, forced into some outreach program with Kendra. Resentment bubbled within him. The following evening, Jacob arrived at the community center, the building humming with energy. He was scheduled to meet Kendra for his first outreach event. As he walked in, he spotted her talking to a group of women, each with children in tow, and he couldn't help but notice the way she spoke with them. Her voice warm, her smile genuine. When she caught sight of him, her expression shifted, becoming more formal. She approached him, her posture composed yet distant. "Officer Foster, thank you for coming. We'll be starting soon. If you'll follow me, I'll introduce you to some of the community members." Without waiting for his response, she led him toward a small group gathered near a table filled with refreshments. The people here were different from the ones Jacob encountered on his patrols. Some were black, others Hispanic, a few looked Middle Eastern. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves, eyes wide with curiosity as they took in the uniformed officer. "This is Officer Jacob Foster," Kendra introduced him, her tone respectful yet somehow cool. "He's here to learn more about our community, to understand the challenges we face." The attendees greeted him politely, but he sensed an undercurrent of tension. He could see it in their guarded smiles, in the way some of them held their children a bit closer. He shifted uncomfortably, acutely aware of his uniform's weight on his shoulders. The evening passed slowly. Jacob sat quietly, listening as person after person shared stories about the struggles they'd faced. A mother spoke tearfully about her son, who'd been stopped by police 3 times in 1 week for fitting a description. An elderly man recounted how he was followed in stores whenever he went to the nicer parts of town. Each story made Jacob feel defensive, but he kept his mouth shut, fighting the urge to justify his profession. He told himself he was different, that he'd only been doing his job. Yet the doubt from Captain Taylor's words returned, nagging at the back of his mind. Finally, Kendra rose and addressed the room. "I want to thank Officer Foster for coming tonight," she said, her gaze fixed on him. "It's not easy to step into unfamiliar territory, to confront uncomfortable truths. But it's a necessary part of growth, of building trust." Her words stung more than Jacob cared to admit, though he sensed a genuine hope in her tone, as if she believed he could change. When the meeting concluded, Jacob hurriedly made his way to the door, feeling overwhelmed and ready to be anywhere else. But as he reached the exit, he heard Kendra's voice behind him. "Officer Foster, wait." He turned, keeping his expression neutral. She approached him, arms folded. "Thank you for being here tonight. I hope this is the beginning of a real shift in perspective." Jacob nodded stiffly, feeling resentment rise within him. "You know, Miss Taylor, I don't need a lecture on doing my job. I've been doing this for over 20 years. I know how to protect this community." Kendra studied him, a faint smile playing at her lips, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Protecting people, Officer Foster, means more than keeping them out of jail or preventing a crime. Sometimes it means understanding what they go through, seeing them for who they are. not who you assume them to be." Her words, calm yet cutting, left Jacob speechless. Without waiting for a response, Kendra turned and walked back into the center, leaving him standing alone in the night. Over the next few weeks, Jacob attended more community meetings, observing interactions he would have once dismissed as irrelevant. He watched Kendra talk to people with a quiet dignity, heard her listen without judgment, her compassion for those around her as clear as day. Slowly, he started seeing familiar faces, people who began to trust him enough to share their stories. One evening, after a particularly difficult meeting, Jacob found himself seated beside Kendra on a bench outside the community center. The air was thick with the scent of pine and the quiet hum of evening traffic. For the first time since their tense encounter in the store, he felt compelled to speak to her. "Kendra," he began, hesitating as he searched for the right words. I think I get it. At least a little. It's not easy for me to admit, but maybe I've been wrong. Maybe I've been seeing people through a lens I didn't realize was there." Kendra nodded, a soft, understanding smile on her face. "Change isn't easy, Officer Foster, but it's never too late to start." In that moment, Jacob felt something shift, a weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. He couldn't yet articulate it, but the anger and resentment he'd held onto seemed to dissolve, replaced by an uncomfortable, humbling truth. He had a long way to go, but for the first time, he was willing to take the first step. A hard look in the mirror. The crisp morning air greeted Jacob as he parked his patrol car outside the precinct. It had been several weeks since Captain Taylor placed him on probation and required him to participate in the community outreach program. While his initial resentment had dulled, something else had taken root, a nagging, uncomfortable awareness of his own actions. After one of the evening sessions at the community center, he found himself lost in thought, replaying encounters he'd had over the years. Faces blurred together, and while he struggled to admit it, Jacob was beginning to recognize a pattern. One face, in particular, kept surfacing in his mind. A young black man he'd stopped the previous year simply because he looked suspicious. In truth, Jacob couldn't even recall what had raised his suspicion, and that realization unsettled him more than he cared to admit. As Jacob made his way through the precinct's halls, he felt the weight of quiet scrutiny from his fellow officers. News of his probation had circulated, and he was aware of the whispers, the quiet nods of sympathy mixed with judgment. His closest friend on the force, Officer Mike Donovan, intercepted him by the coffee machine. "Foster," Mike greeted, his voice low as he handed Jacob a coffee. "Been a tough few weeks, va?" Jacob accepted the coffee with a nod. "You could say that." Mike leaned against the wall, eyeing him with a mixture of concern and disbelief. "Can't believe the captain's making you go through all that community outreach nonsense. You've been on the job longer than most of us. We know what we're doing out there. We keep this place safe, don't we?" Jacob hesitated, remembering the stories he'd heard at the community center, the heartache, the fear, and the mistrust. For the first time, he wasn't so sure of the answer. "Look, Mike," he started, keeping his voice low. "I'm beginning to think there's more to it. Some of the things people go through. I never even thought about it like that before." Mike frowned, an edge of frustration in his gaze. "Come on, Jake. Don't let them make you soft. This is about doing our job, not hand-holding. If you start second-guessing yourself every time someone accuses you of bias, you won't make it in this line of work." Jacob forced a nod, but the words didn't feel right. He returned to his desk, where a stack of reports waited, but his focus waned. He felt adrift, caught between the familiar world of law enforcement and the new reality he was glimpsing through Kendra's outreach. Later that week, Kendra invited Jacob to a community panel, an event designed to bridge the gap between the police force and local residents. When Jacob arrived, the hall was already bustling with activity, community members chatting in small groups. His uniform seemed to attract more than a few wary glances, which he ignored as best as he could. Kendra spotted him from across the room and walked over. "Officer Foster, glad you could make it," she said, her voice warm, but her gaze serious. "Tonight's about listening, so let's try to keep an open mind, all right?" He nodded, mentally bracing himself. "Understood." They took seats near the front as the panel began, a lineup of community members seated alongside a handful of police officers. The moderator, a woman named Mrs. Castillo with a gentle voice and warm smile, welcomed everyone, then opened the floor for people to share their experiences. One of the first speakers was a teenager named Jamal, who looked no older than 17. He stood up, his eyes darting nervously between the officers and the crowd. I don't usually talk about this stuff," he began, voice trembling. "But a few months ago, I was walking home from work, and an officer pulled me over. Told me I fit a description." He paused, the words seeming to catch in his throat. "I tried to explain I was just going home, but he made me sit on the curb while he checked my ID. People were watching, thinking I'd done something wrong, and I couldn't do anything about it." Jacob's stomach clenched. He knew that scenario all too well. He'd done it himself many times, stopping someone simply because they seemed out of place or matched a description. His gaze dropped to his hands, which were clenched tightly in his lap. As Jamal continued, recounting the humiliation of that night, Jacob felt a strange mix of empathy and shame. For years, he'd convinced himself that these stops were routine, necessary for community safety. But now, hearing it from Jamal's perspective, he felt the sting of doubt again. The next speaker was an older man named Mr. Grayson, a retired schoolteacher. His voice carried a quiet, steady dignity as he recounted a lifetime of prejudice and fear whenever he encountered the police. "I've lived here for over 40 years," Mr. Grayson began, his voice calm yet weary. "I volunteer at the school, help with the neighborhood watch, and I've raised my children here, but I still feel that tension every time I see a patrol car. Not because I've done anything wrong, but because I know that one assumption, one moment of suspicion, could change my life forever." Jacob felt the room's collective silence weigh down on him as he listened. These weren't criminals or troublemakers. They were people who wanted to feel safe in their own neighborhoods. Yet here they were, voicing fears that he had never fully understood. When the panel concluded, Jacob walked out of the hall, his mind reeling. He felt Kendra's presence beside him, and turned to face her. "Kendra," he began, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't know it was like this. I never thought that my actions could have this kind of impact." Kendra regarded him with a mixture of sympathy and quiet resolve. "That's why I wanted you to be here, Jacob, to see how our lives are affected in ways that are invisible to you. But now that you know, the question is, what are you going to do about it?" Jacob opened his mouth to respond, but found he had no answer. He'd always prided himself on his ability to do what was right, to make tough calls. But now, faced with the reality of his own blind spots, he felt at a loss. A few days later, as Jacob was wrapping up his shift, he received a call from Captain Taylor. "Foster, I'd like you to come to my office. There's someone here who wants to speak with you." Curious and a bit apprehensive, Jacob made his way down the hall. As he entered the office, he froze. Seated across from Captain Taylor was Kendra, her expression calm but serious. She gave him a small nod as he took a seat. Captain Taylor leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "Foster, we're about to begin a new initiative, an empathy-based training program for officers, aimed at bridging gaps with the community. It'll involve regular training sessions and mentorship with community leaders. Kendra has volunteered to lead some of these sessions." Jacob felt his pulse quicken. The very idea of an empathy program made him feel uncomfortable, almost exposed, but he could sense this was non-negotiable. "You'll be the first officer to go through the program, Jacob," Captain Taylor continued, his voice firm. "And if you complete it, I'll remove the probation from your record." The implications hung heavy in the air. This wasn't just a training program. It was a trial, a test of whether Jacob could truly change. With a tight nod, Jacob agreed, though part of him felt a swell of resentment. He didn't like being singled out, didn't like the idea of having to prove his understanding. But another part of him, smaller yet insistent, wanted to know if he could rise to the challenge. The first session took place in the community center's gym, where chairs were arranged in a circle. Kendra stood at the front, her hands clasped, as officers and community members filed in. Jacob found himself seated between a fellow officer and a local resident, an elderly woman with kind eyes who introduced herself as Mrs. Thompson. The session began with Kendra speaking about empathy, not just as a concept, but as a practice. Empathy isn't about feeling sorry for someone, she said, her voice steady. It's about listening, truly understanding someone's experience, and imagining how you'd feel if it were your own. She invited everyone to share something about themselves, something that shaped who they were. When it was Jacob's turn, he shifted uncomfortably, but cleared his throat. I grew up in this town, went to the same school my father did, and I always knew I'd be a cop. It's a family tradition. I guess I saw it as my duty to uphold the law, just like he did. Mrs. Thompson gave him a soft smile. And how do you see it now, Officer Foster? Jacob hesitated, glancing around the room. I don't know, he admitted. I thought I was doing my job the best way I knew how. But now, I'm realizing maybe I haven't always seen the full picture. The words felt strange coming out, as though admitting a weakness he hadn't recognized. Kendra's gaze softened, and she gave him an encouraging nod, her expression one of hope and patience. As the session wrapped up, Jacob felt an odd sense of relief. This wasn't just about punishment, it was a chance to reshape how he saw the world, how he did his job, and who he was. That night, lying in bed, Jacob stared at the ceiling, his mind racing with memories and questions he could no longer push aside. He realized that to grow, to be the person he wanted to be, he had to confront his assumptions and acknowledge his past mistakes. He could no longer cling to the idea that he was always right. That was a painful truth, but for the first time, he felt ready to confront it. And in doing so, he knew he might finally find the kind of officer and man he wanted to become. Turning point. A damp chill filled the early morning air as Jacob sat on a park bench, his gaze fixed on the sprawling community garden across from him. He'd just come from a session with Kendra at the community center, and though he had only been in the program for a few weeks, he felt worlds away from the officer he'd been. Lost in thought, he didn't notice Captain Marcus Taylor approaching until the captain was right in front of him. "Mind if I sit?" Taylor asked, his tone softer than Jacob had expected. Jacob nodded, and the two men sat in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken thoughts hanging between them. "Jacob," Taylor began, his gaze fixed on the morning fog lifting over the garden. "You've been on the force a long time, but I think we both know this isn't easy for you. This journey, it's hard to question your instincts after so many years." Jacob glanced at his captain, nodding reluctantly. "You're right. I've spent my whole career convinced I was doing the right thing, following what I thought were my instincts. But now it's like I'm seeing cracks in what I thought was solid ground." Captain Taylor gave him a knowing look. "Jacob, real strength isn't about ignoring your flaws. It's about facing them, doing the hard work of understanding yourself." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "This program you're in with Kendra, it's not just for you. We're hoping to implement it for other officers as well, but we need to know it can work." Jacob shifted, a surge of self-doubt filling him. "So, this is a trial run." "In a way," Taylor replied, his gaze steady. "But it's also about giving you a chance to redefine what it means to be a good cop. This town is changing, Jacob. We have to change with it if we're going to do our jobs right." The captain's words lingered with Jacob long after he left the park, the conversation casting a new light on the journey he'd embarked on. It wasn't just about redemption, it was about transformation. A few evenings later, Jacob was back at the community center, helping set up chairs for a family support meeting organized by Kendra. As he straightened the last row, He noticed a young girl sitting in the corner, her gaze fixed on the door as if waiting for someone. She couldn't have been more than 10, with a shy smile and eyes that seemed to hold a world of stories. Kendra approached him, holding a stack of pamphlets. She noticed his gaze and followed it. "That's Tessa," she said softly. "Her mother's in the program. They've been through a lot. Tessa's father was deported a few years ago. It's been hard for her, adjusting to life here without him." Jacob felt a pang in his chest. He had never considered the personal stories behind the families in the community, the struggles that lay beneath the surface. The meeting began, and Jacob found himself seated beside Tessa and her mother, Maria, a petite woman with a quiet, resilient presence. She spoke with a thick accent, her words deliberate and hesitant as she shared her journey. "My husband was taken away when Tessa was 7, Maria said, her voice trembling. "Since then, it's just been the two of us. I work 2 jobs, and sometimes I worry she will grow up thinking the world is against her." Maria's words hit Jacob hard. He could see the love she had for her daughter, the weight of her fears, and the strength that kept her going. This was a side of the community he'd been blind to for so long, and as he listened, a small crack opened in his heart. When the meeting ended, Tessa tugged at his sleeve, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Are you really a police officer?" she asked, her voice small. Jacob nodded, feeling the strange sense of vulnerability under her gaze. "Yes, I am." "Do you protect people like my mom?" she asked, her question laced with hope and uncertainty. He hesitated, the weight of her question pressing down on him. "I try to, Tessa. I'm trying to get better at it." Her smile was small but genuine, and as she took her mother's hand and left, Jacob felt a deep-seated resolve harden within him. This was his chance to make things right, not just with Kendra, but with the community he'd sworn to protect. That weekend, Kendra invited Jacob to join her at a neighborhood block party. It was an annual event in Meadowville, held in a part of town that Jacob rarely patrolled. When he arrived, the air was filled with the smell of barbecued meat and the sounds of laughter and music. Children darted between tables, and families gathered in clusters, chatting and laughing. Kendra met him near a food stand, handing him a paper plate piled high with ribs and coleslaw. "Try to enjoy yourself today," she said with a small smile. "This isn't a work assignment, just get to know people." Jacob nodded, taking in the festive atmosphere. He felt a sense of warmth, a kind of connection he hadn't experienced in years. As he moved through the crowd, he recognized some of the people he'd met at the community meetings. They greeted him warmly, inviting him into conversations, sharing stories of their families, their jobs, their dreams. At one point, a middle-aged man named Carl, who ran a local grocery store, pulled him aside. "Officer Foster," Carl said, his tone friendly but serious, "I've heard about what you're trying to do, going through the outreach program and all. I just want to say, I respect that. Takes guts to change." Jacob felt a surge of gratitude. "Thank you, Carl. I'm still learning." Carl patted him on the shoulder. "That's all any of us can do." The rest of the day passed in a blur of laughter, food, and heartfelt connections. Jacob found himself absorbed in conversations that ranged from lighthearted banter to profound stories of resilience. He felt himself slowly shedding the rigid mindset he'd held for so long, opening up to new perspectives and a new sense of purpose. As the sun began to set, Jacob found himself sitting beside Kendra on the steps of the community center, watching the last few families pack up and head home. "You know what," he said, his voice quiet. "I used to think I knew what this job was about, but I don't think I had a clue." Kendra looked at him, a gentle smile on her face. "Understanding the people we serve isn't easy. It takes more than just showing up. It takes a willingness to see beyond the badge." Jacob nodded, letting her words sink in. "Kendra, I owe you more than just an apology. This journey, it's given me a new way of seeing things, of seeing people. I think, for the first time, I actually understand what it means to protect this community. Kendra placed a hand on his shoulder. You're doing the work, Jacob, and that's what matters. In the weeks that followed, Jacob threw himself into the program with renewed dedication. He continued attending community events, and as he spent more time with people he'd once seen as other, his sense of empathy deepened. He found himself questioning past assumptions, reflecting on encounters he'd once brushed off without a second thought. One night, as he was leaving a meeting, he overheard a conversation between two teenage boys near the entrance. "Man, cops just don't care about us," one of them muttered. "They just want to lock us up." Jacob felt a pang of guilt but approached them cautiously. "Hey guys," he said, keeping his tone friendly. "Mind if I join the conversation?" The boys exchanged wary glances but shrugged. Jacob introduced himself, and soon they were in a frank discussion about police-community relations. The boys didn't hold back, voicing frustrations and fears Jacob hadn't fully grasped until now. They spoke of being followed in stores, of being stopped for matching a description, of feeling unwelcome in their own neighborhood. For Jacob, each word was like a wake-up call, a reminder of the lives he'd impacted without even realizing it. He'd come to the community center to redeem himself, but now he realized it was about more than that. It was about creating real, lasting change. When the conversation ended, one of the boys, Malik, looked at him thoughtfully. "You're different from the other cops I've met," he said. "You actually listen." Jacob smiled, a sense of pride and humility filling him. "I'm trying, Malik. I'm really trying." One evening, as Jacob was preparing to leave the precinct, Captain Taylor called him into his office. "Foster," Taylor began, his expression softer than usual, "I want you to know that I have been following your progress. Kendra tells me you're doing well in the program." Jacob felt a swell of pride. "Thank you, sir. I've learned more in these past weeks than I have in years on the force." Taylor nodded, his gaze steady. "You've been given a second chance, Jacob. Not everyone gets that. Remember that, and keep doing the work." Jacob left the captain's office with a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time, he felt like he was not just a part of the community, but an ally to the people he served. He was beginning to understand the true weight of his role, not as an enforcer, but as a protector, a bridge between worlds. And as he drove through the quiet streets that night, he felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that he was on the path to becoming the officer he'd always aspired to be. Tested under fire. The streetlights cast long shadows over Meadowville's main street as Jacob drove through the neighborhood, his mind buzzing with thoughts from his recent sessions with Kendra. His newfound awareness had brought a sense of calm, but it also exposed him to vulnerabilities he hadn't known he had. He felt less certain, more cautious, and yet, paradoxically, more in touch with his role as a protector than he ever had been. Just as he rounded a familiar corner, his radio crackled to life. "All units, we have a disturbance in progress at the intersection of Maple and East. Possible altercation. Requesting immediate assistance." Jacob's pulse quickened. Maple and East was a busy intersection near a string of late-night cafes and bars. His hand hovered over the radio, his heart pounding as he weighed the possible outcomes. This could be his chance to prove that his change wasn't just theoretical. It was real, and he would handle this situation differently from any before it. As he approached the scene, he saw a small crowd gathered. Two young men stood in the middle of the street, faces tense, voices raised, postures squared off as if ready to fight. One of them was Malik, the teenager Jacob had recently spoken with at the community center. The other was a young man Jacob didn't recognize, wearing a dark hoodie and looking equally agitated. Jacob stepped out of his car, making his way slowly toward them, keenly aware of the tension in the air. The crowd seemed wary, their eyes darting between him and the young men, as if anticipating the worst. He could feel their fear, the distrust, the memory of past encounters that had ended badly. He sensed that every movement he made was being scrutinized. "Wait." "Hey, Malik," he called, his tone calm and steady. "What's going on here?" Malik glanced his way, the anger in his face giving way to a look of hesitation. He lowered his fists slightly, but the other young man didn't relax. "Stay out of this, man," the stranger snapped, his voice tinged with defiance. "This isn't your business." Jacob held his hands up in a gesture of peace. "Listen, I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want to understand what's happening, all right?" The young man scoffed, his stance rigid. "Yeah, right. You think we're gonna believe that? Cops don't help us. They just look for reasons to mess with us." Jacob took a deep breath, letting the words settle. He understood that mistrust now. He had witnessed it at the community meetings, seen it in the eyes of people like Maria, Tessa, and Malik. They weren't just resisting him. They were resisting a history of encounters with law enforcement that had left them feeling vulnerable and disregarded. But tonight, he vowed, would be different. "Look, I get it," Jacob replied, his voice low but sincere. "You don't know me, and you don't have a reason to trust me. But I spent the last few weeks learning, listening to people from this community, trying to understand how to do better. Give me a chance to prove it." Malik exchanged a wary glance with his opponent, who seemed unconvinced. The young man in the hoodie crossed his arms, his gaze hard and distrustful. "You don't know what it's like for us," he muttered. "You come in here with your uniform, your badge, acting like you're all about serving and protecting. But it's always the same. Just leave us alone." The crowd shifted, murmuring in agreement, their eyes flicking between Jacob and the two young men. Jacob felt the weight of their gaze, their expectations. He knew that one wrong move could shatter everything he'd worked to rebuild. "Tell me what happened," Jacob urged, keeping his tone even. "If you can trust me enough to do that, I promise to listen." Malik looked away, his shoulders slumping slightly. We had an argument, okay? About something stupid. It got out of hand." The other young man clenched his fists, his voice shaking with frustration. "He thinks he can disrespect me and just walk away. I'm not letting that happen." Jacob took a step closer, careful to keep his movements slow and non-threatening. "You're both here, in front of a crowd, getting ready to fight. But let me tell you something. It takes a lot more strength to walk away. It's not about who's right or wrong. It's about not letting a moment like this ruin your future." The young man hesitated, the fire in his eyes flickering. He looked to Malik, then back at Jacob, the tension in his body slowly easing. Jacob took another step, closing the distance between them. "I know it's hard," Jacob continued, his voice softening. "But trust me, you don't want this. You have a chance right now to make a different choice." Malik sighed, his fists unclenching as he lowered his gaze to the ground. After a long pause, he nodded. "All right. I'll walk away." The crowd murmured in surprise as Malik took a step back, his posture relaxing. His opponent followed suit, the defiance in his expression replaced by a flicker of relief. The onlookers began to disperse, a sense of calm settling over the scene. As the two young men went their separate ways, Jacob felt a surge of pride and relief. This wasn't the easy way out. It was the right way, the respectful way. He had broken through the cycle of confrontation and distrust, if only for a moment, and shown the community that change was possible. The next day, word of the incident spread through the precinct, and Jacob found himself the subject of quiet admiration and scrutiny. He knew some of his colleagues doubted his approach, that they saw it as weakness rather than strength. But he also knew he was finally becoming the kind of officer he wanted to be, the kind that could make a genuine difference. That evening, he met Kendra for their scheduled session. She had heard about the incident and greeted him with a proud smile. "You handled that well," she said, her tone warm. "It takes a lot of courage to break away from old habits, especially in a situation like that." Jacob nodded, the memory of the confrontation still fresh. "I didn't realize how much I'd been hiding behind my badge, how I'd let my instincts control me without question. But that night, I saw it differently. I knew I had to earn their trust, not demand it." Kendra placed a hand on his shoulder, her gaze filled with understanding. This journey isn't just about changing how you do your job, Jacob. It's about transforming who you are, inside and out. And I think you're finally starting to understand that. He felt a swell of gratitude, knowing that he wouldn't have reached this point without her guidance. Kendra had shown him a path he hadn't even known existed, a way to honor his duty while respecting the people he served. The next few weeks passed in a blur of community events and outreach sessions, each one reinforcing Jacob's commitment to his transformation. He spoke to more people, heard their stories, and shared parts of his own journey, hoping to bridge the gap between himself and the community he once misunderstood. One afternoon, as he was helping clean up after an event at the community center, he heard a familiar voice call his name. Officer Foster. He turned to see Maria and Tessa, the mother and daughter he'd met at one of his first meetings. Tessa ran over, a wide grin on her face as she held out a small bouquet of wildflowers. "These are for you," she said shyly, her eyes shining with pride. Jacob knelt to her level, accepting the flowers with a smile. "Thank you, Tessa. These are beautiful." Maria stepped forward, her expression warm and grateful. "Thank you, Officer Foster, for everything you've done. It means a lot to us." Jacob felt a lump form in his throat as he looked at Maria and Tessa, realizing the impact his journey had made. He wasn't just changing himself. He was changing the lives of those around him, building a bridge between himself and the community that had once viewed him with distrust. As he watched Maria and Tessa walk away, he felt a deep sense of purpose settle within him. This was the kind of impact he'd always wanted to have, the kind that went beyond arrests and patrols, the kind that healed rather than harmed. Back at the precinct, Jacob was approached by Officer Mike Donovan, his former partner and friend who had been one of his most vocal critics throughout his journey. "Foster," Mike began, his tone begrudging but respectful. "I heard about what happened with those kids the other night. Gotta say, I didn't think you had it in you." Jacob shrugged, his voice calm. "It's not about having it in me, Mike. It's about realizing that we're part of this community, and if we don't understand them, if we don't respect them, then we're failing at our jobs." Mike looked away, a flicker of regret in his expression. "Maybe you're right. It's hard to change, you know." Jacob nodded, understanding the struggle all too well. "Yeah, it is, but it's worth it." For the first time, Mike looked at him with genuine respect, as if seeing his friend in a new light. It was a small victory, but for Jacob, it symbolized something bigger, a shift in the culture, a step toward a more compassionate, more understanding approach to policing. As he left the precinct that night, Jacob felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that his journey was far from over. But he was no longer the same man who had confronted Kendra in that boutique all those months ago. He was stronger, wiser, and more attuned to the needs of his community. And as he drove through the quiet streets of Meadowville, he knew that he would carry this newfound understanding with him, using it to serve and protect in ways he hadn't previously thought possible. Because true strength, he had learned, came not from enforcing authority, but from earning trust, and he was finally ready to embrace that truth, every step of the way. Full circle. The brisk winter air cut through Meadowville, blanketing the town in a quiet stillness as Jacob Foster stood outside the community center, staring up at the twinkling holiday lights strung along the eaves. It had been almost a year since Captain Taylor put him on probation, thrusting him into a journey of self-discovery that had pushed him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Now he was no longer just a police officer in this community. He was a part of it. As he stood there, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride and gratitude. He'd come a long way since that day in the boutique when he'd first confronted Kendra. And though he still had moments of doubt, he felt a sense of peace in knowing he had grown, learned, and transformed. Tonight's community gathering was a holiday celebration, a chance for families and neighbors to come together, share stories, and enjoy the season. The sounds of laughter and music drifted through the air as people gathered around tables laden with food, children running around with cups of hot chocolate. Kendra spotted him from across the room and waved him over, a bright smile lighting up her face. Beside her stood Captain Taylor, his expression warm with pride as he watched Jacob approach. "You made it," Kendra said, her tone light with a hint of teasing. "I was beginning to think you'd miss out on all the fun." Jacob chuckled, shaking his head. "I wouldn't miss this for the world." Captain Taylor clasped Jacob on the shoulder, his grip firm and steady. "Foster, I want you to know how proud I am of you. You've done the work, put in the effort, and made a difference, not just for yourself, but for everyone here." Jacob felt a surge of pride as he looked around, taking in the faces of those he'd come to know so well over the past year. He saw Maria and Tessa chatting with a group of other mothers, Malik and his friends laughing by the snack table, and even Mrs. Thompson from the empathy training sessions waving at him with a warm smile. They were more than just members of his community now. They were his friends, his neighbors, his people. As he basked in the moment, the sound of a commotion outside drew his attention. The laughter and music faded, replaced by the concerned murmurs of the crowd as people began to gather near the entrance. Jacob felt a familiar sense of duty kick in as he moved toward the door, his eyes scanning the crowd for signs of trouble. Outside, he saw a group of teenagers huddled near the street, their voices raised in tense whispers. Among them was Malik, his face set in a look of concern as he tried to calm down a young man Jacob recognized from one of the recent outreach events. The boy looked no older than 16, his face pale, his hands shaking as he clutched a small plastic bag filled with what looked like pills. Jacob's heart sank. He knew all too well what those pills represented: a world of trouble, pain, and consequences that no one should have to face alone. He took a deep breath, steeling himself as he approached the group, careful to keep his movements calm and non-threatening. "Malik," he called softly, his tone gentle but firm. "What's going on here?" Malik looked up, his eyes filled with a mix of relief and apprehension. "Officer Foster, it's my cousin, Jameer. He got mixed up with the wrong people, and he's scared. They're pressuring him to sell, and he doesn't know what to do." Jacob nodded, his gaze shifting to Jameer, whose face was etched with fear and uncertainty. "Jameer," he said, keeping his tone calm and reassuring, "I know you're scared, but you're not alone. We can help you, but you have to trust me." The boy hesitated, his eyes darting between Jacob and Malik, a flicker of hope mingling with the fear in his gaze. He took a shaky breath, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want to do it, but they said they'd hurt my family if I didn't. I don't know how to get out." Jacob felt a surge of empathy as he listened, his heart aching for the boy. He knew that Jameer's situation was all too common, a tragic result of a system that often failed to protect those who needed it most. "I understand," Jacob said softly, his voice filled with compassion. "But there's always a way out. Let's go inside, talk this through, and find a way to keep you and your family safe." Jameer looked at him, a glimmer of hope in his eyes as he nodded slowly. Together, they made their way back inside the community center, where Kendra and Captain Taylor were waiting, their faces filled with concern and understanding. As they sat down to talk, Jacob took the lead, guiding Jameer through his options, explaining the resources available to help him break free from the dangerous path he found himself on. Kendra offered words of comfort, her presence a soothing balm to the boy's troubled spirit, while Captain Taylor assured him that he would have the full support of the precinct in keeping his family safe. By the time their conversation ended, Jameer's shoulders had relaxed, a look of relief softening the tension in his face. He thanked Jacob, Kendra, and Captain Taylor, his voice trembling with gratitude as he promised to stay away from those who'd tried to lead him astray. When Jameer and Malik left, Jacob felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing he had made a real difference. This wasn't just about stopping a crime. It was about changing a life, offering hope and support to someone who had felt abandoned and alone. Kendra placed a hand on his shoulder, her gaze filled with pride and warmth. "You did good, Jacob. You gave that boy a chance he might not have had otherwise." Captain Taylor nodded in agreement, his eyes shining with pride. "This is what it means to serve, Jacob. Not just to enforce the law, but to be a guide, a protector, a friend. You've proven yourself to be all of those things." Jacob felt a swell of gratitude as he looked around the room, taking in the faces of the people he had come to know and care for. In that moment, he realized that his journey had come full circle. He was no longer just an officer of the law. He was a member of the community, a trusted ally, a friend. In the weeks that followed, Jacob continued his work with renewed purpose, reaching out to young people like Jameer, offering guidance and support to those who found themselves at the crossroads of hardship and hope. He became a mentor to the teenagers in the community, organizing youth programs, speaking at schools, and collaborating with Kendra to create safe spaces where young people could find the help they needed. He knew that he couldn't change the world on his own, but he also knew that every life he touched, every story he listened to, every person he helped, was a step toward building a better, safer Meadowville. And as the days turned into months, Jacob saw the impact of his work ripple through the community. People who had once viewed him with suspicion now greeted him with warmth and gratitude, their trust in him a testament to the journey he had undertaken. He had become more than just an officer. He had become a friend, a mentor, a role model. One evening, as he was locking up the community center after a youth outreach event, he felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Malik, a broad smile on his face as he handed Jacob a small, handmade card. "For you, Officer Foster," Malik said, his voice filled with emotion. "We wanted to thank you for everything you've done for us." Jacob opened the card, his heart swelling as he read the words inside. "To Officer Foster, thank you for believing in us, for listening to us, for standing by us. You've shown us what it means to be strong, to be kind, to be a true friend. We're grateful for you, and we're proud to have you in our lives." Jacob blinked back tears, his voice thick with emotion as he looked at Malik. "Thank you, Malik. I'm proud to know all of you too." They stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of the journey they had all shared settling between them. In that quiet moment, Jacob realized that he had finally found his purpose, his true calling, not just as an officer, but as a friend, a mentor, a member of the community. As he walked home that night, his heart filled with gratitude. He felt a sense of peace he had never known before. He had come a long way from the man he once was, and he knew that his journey was far from over. But he was ready for whatever lay ahead, knowing that he was no longer just a guardian of the law, but a protector of the people he had come to love. And as he looked up at the stars twinkling in the night sky, he knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be, home. A legacy of trust. The first spring blooms dotted the gardens around Meadowville as Jacob Foster walked the familiar streets, the vibrant colors reflecting the renewed energy he felt within. Over a year had passed since he'd begun his journey of redemption, and every interaction, every face, was a reminder of the community he'd come to love and serve. Yet he knew his work was far from complete. With each day, new challenges emerged, and he was determined to continue growing, not just for himself, but for the people who now trusted him as a protector and friend. Today, Jacob had been invited to speak at Meadowville High School for a Youth Empowerment Day, organized by Kendra and other community leaders. The goal was to give young people insight into the possibilities for their future and introduce them to role models from various professions. Jacob was both honored and a bit nervous, wondering if his story would resonate with a crowd that might still view law enforcement with a degree of skepticism. As he entered the high school auditorium, the room buzzed with the chatter of students and teachers, and he spotted familiar faces from his work at the community center. Malik and Tessa waved at him from the front row, their expressions filled with pride and encouragement. He smiled, feeling the surge of warmth. These weren't just kids he'd helped. They were part of his extended family. When his turn came to speak, Jacob took a deep breath and looked out over the crowd. He saw both curiosity and apprehension in the students' faces. He was a police officer, after all, and that title came with its own set of preconceptions. But Jacob knew that honesty and vulnerability would bridge that gap. He cleared his throat and began. "Thank you for letting me be here today," he started, his voice steady but soft. "When I was your age, I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. I ended up following in my father's footsteps, joining the police force right after high school. I thought I understood what it meant to protect and serve. But honestly, it took me 20 years to really understand that those words mean so much more than just enforcing the law." A hush settled over the auditorium as he shared his story, the incident at the boutique, his journey with Kendra, the empathy training, and the transformative experiences with the community. He spoke about the doubts he'd faced, the biases he'd confronted, and the mistakes he'd made, not hiding any details. For him, this was more than just a speech. It was an open letter to the next generation. "But I'm not here to ask for forgiveness," Jacob continued, his gaze meeting the eyes of several students who looked at him with rapt attention. "I'm here to show you that change is possible, no matter how deeply rooted our beliefs may seem. We all have the power to grow, to listen, to understand the lives around us. And for those of you who might one day consider law enforcement or community work, know that you don't have to choose between strength and empathy. The strongest thing you can do is care." When he finished, the silence in the room was profound, a weight of understanding passing between him and the students. A hand shot up in the audience, and Jacob smiled as he recognized Tessa's eager face. "Officer Foster," she began, her voice filled with admiration. "What's the most important thing you've learned?" Jacob took a moment to gather his thoughts. "I think the most important thing I've learned is that listening is a superpower. Really listening to someone, without judgment, can break down walls you never knew existed. It can heal, it can inspire, and it can create bonds that last a lifetime." The applause that followed was thunderous, and as Jacob left the stage, he felt a profound sense of fulfillment. He was no longer just Officer Foster. He was a role model, a symbol of change, and he was determined to keep that promise to his community. As Jacob's commitment deepened, so did his challenges. A few weeks after the school event, he received a call from Captain Taylor. Meadowville was experiencing a sudden increase in vandalism, and some residents suspected it was part of a gang initiation. Jacob's heart sank as he listened to the report. He knew that these incidents could quickly spiral, leading to deeper divides and fears within the community. But instead of approaching the issue as he might have in the past, Jacob saw it as an opportunity for proactive outreach. After meeting with Kendra and several community leaders, he proposed a plan: organize neighborhood forums where residents could voice their concerns, and partner with youth mentors to create support groups for teens at risk of gang involvement. The first forum was held at a local park, where residents gathered around picnic tables under the late afternoon sun. The mood was tense, filled with concerns over the safety of their neighborhoods, frustration with the vandalism, and questions about how to protect their families. Jacob addressed the crowd, his tone measured and respectful. "I know you're frustrated," he said, acknowledging the fears in their faces. "But we have two choices here. We can react, or we can respond. Reacting would mean treating this as just a crime to be punished. But responding means taking action to prevent it from happening again. That's what we're here to do, find a solution together as a community." One by one, residents shared their thoughts, their worries, their fears for their children. Jacob listened to each story, his heart aching as he heard the pain and frustration that lay beneath their words. And as the conversation unfolded, an idea took shape. What if we created a mentorship program for at-risk teens? He suggested, his gaze moving from face to face. A place where they could come, talk, and learn from adults who faced similar challenges. We can give them a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose, because I think we all know that sometimes These actions come from a place of feeling lost. The response was overwhelming. Volunteers stepped forward, offering to mentor, lead workshops, and help organize activities for the program. Kendra agreed to help coordinate, and within weeks, the Meadowville Youth Alliance was born, a safe space where teens could find guidance, support, and community. They offered classes on everything from job skills to art and sports, along with mentorship from adults who had walked similar paths. One afternoon, as Jacob was leaving the youth center, he felt a tug on his arm. He turned to see Jameer, the young man he had helped a few months earlier, his face brimming with excitement. "Officer Foster," Jameer exclaimed, holding up a certificate. "I just completed my first workshop on photography. They even gave me this camera to practice with." Jacob felt a swell of pride as he looked at the boy's glowing face. "That's incredible, Jameer. You're making real progress. Keep it up." Jameer nodded, a look of determination in his eyes. "I'm going to be a photographer, you know. I want to show people the beauty in our community, the way you showed me there was more to life than I thought." Jacob felt a lump in his throat as he ruffled Jameer's hair. "You're going to do great things, Jameer. I have no doubt about that." As he walked away, Jacob felt the weight of his journey settle around him, not as a burden, but as a legacy. He had come so far, faced so many challenges, and grown in ways he never anticipated. And now, seeing Jameer, Malik, Tessa, and so many others find their own paths, he knew that his role went beyond law enforcement. He was leaving a legacy of trust, of empathy, of hope. Months turned into seasons, and as the summer sun warmed Meadowville, Jacob was invited to a small ceremony at the community center. He arrived to find the place decorated with balloons and banners, children running around with beaming smiles, and residents gathered to honor the work he and Kendra had done. Captain Taylor stood at the front of the room, a proud smile on his face as he looked out over the crowd. "Today, we're here to celebrate an officer who has shown us the true meaning of service, who has dedicated himself not just to law enforcement, but to building a bridge of understanding and trust within our community." Jacob felt a rush of emotion as he listened, humbled by the recognition. When Captain Taylor called him to the front, the crowd erupted in applause, and he felt the warmth of their support, their pride, their gratitude. "I want to thank each of you," Jacob began, his voice thick with emotion. "Because this journey, this transformation, wouldn't have been possible without your support, your willingness to forgive, and your openness to change. You taught me what it truly means to serve, and I promise to carry this lesson with me every day." As the applause died down, Kendra stepped forward, a soft smile on her face. "Officer Foster," she said, her voice filled with warmth and pride, "you've given this community so much, and we want you to know that we're with you, every step of the way." Jacob felt a tear slip down his cheek as he looked out at the faces of those he had come to love and protect. He was no longer just Officer Foster. He was a part of this community, a symbol of trust and hope, a reminder that change was always possible. As the celebration continued, he knew that his work was far from over, but he was ready for whatever lay ahead, knowing that he would face it with compassion, courage, and the unwavering support of his community. Because after all, he had found his place, not as a badge, not as an authority figure, but as a friend, a mentor, a part of Meadowville's heart.